Just before midnight on November 15th, 1966, two married couples from Point Pleasant, West Virginia, saw a creature that they said was a bird, but looked like a man-sized bird with 10-foot long wingspan and 7 feet tall and making strange noises as it chased or flew at their car. The head was small, they said, so it wasn't maybe a man's head, but it had glowing red eyes, and they reported it. And the next day in the local newspaper, the Point Pleasant Register, a story entitled "Couples See Man-Sized Bird Creature Something" ran the next day, giving rise to the legendary creature, the Mothman. On today's episode of Life's Potluck Buffet, I'm going to talk about something that's even scarier to me than the Mothman and some other flying things that might be of interest to you too. This is John Paulus. You're listening to Life's Potluck Buffet, only on YouTube. If you've been enjoying Life's Potluck Buffet, please subscribe. And if you have already subscribed, thank you so much for your support. I truly appreciate it. And thank you to everyone for listening. You know what's scarier to me than the Mothman? A nearly invisible creature called Tiniola bissailiella. And Tiniola bissailiella works, well, at night usually. And Tiniola bissailiella feeds on my Italian wool clothing and causes me to have them rewoven or, in the worst case scenario, which happened recently, disposed of by a reweaver who said there were too many moth holes in this to be worth repairing. What is this scary creature called in English? Usually the common clothes moth, or just a moth, the thing that mothballs are meant to get rid of, and also cedar and cedar oil and cedar-lined cabinets and cedar-lined closets and cedar-lined and cedar chests. These are all meant to keep the moths away from your wool products, which they just love to eat in this almost invisible larval stage where they do their feeding and where they, eventually will emerge as flying moths that we would recognize. But they do their feeding in that larval stage when they're nearly invisible, and that's why you don't see them necessarily on your clothing when they're eating it. It's because they're microscopic at that point. Now, the Tiniola bissailiella is a type of moth. It is a moth. The word Tiniola means little moth in Latin. Tinea is a word in Latin for a type of moth and a type of or worms. It's because they're talking about the caterpillar phase, the larval phase of these creatures when they're actually harmful to things. The word bookworm is also used for the caterpillar larval stage of moths, as well as inchworm, so those things that kind of like their back loops up and then they move forward and then they, that kind of thing. We call them inchworms in English. Those are moths. The caterpillar stage of moth is, the worm type thing. And that is why there's a little bit of a confusion between the words for moth and worm in a lot of languages. But not in all languages. And there's so many different words for moth in so many different languages. I couldn't even begin to go through all of them. But I'll leave you with the word in English, which is moth, which comes from an Old English word, which may be related to the words describing the larval stage of other insects as well. So it uses the word for worm as well. And that is typical of many words that are for moths. And it's, describing the caterpillar stage. Now, caterpillar actually comes from an old French word that has to do with the Latin word catus, which is where we get the word cat from, as in the thing that meows, and perhaps the word fuzzy, really, which makes sense because caterpillars, large caterpillars that you'd notice, do look kind of fuzzy, and that makes sense for that. The cat part, not sure. Yeah, that's a guess on behalf. That's a speculation, not mine. Other people, but it could be the case. Nonetheless, those fuzzy caterpillars are also the larval stages of the butterflies, of course. And this is something in English that I feel like, because of our words for the two things, because we have a word moth for moths and we have the word butterfly for butterflies, that we tend to think of them as being like really different in the grand scheme of things. They're not so different. They're obviously related creatures, and from looking at them, you think, well, these kind of look vaguely similar, but they're a little bit different in general. What we call a butterfly and what we call a moth. Now, in some languages, because of the nocturnal habits of moths, of many moths, and it's not all of them, but many moths are nocturnal, the word for moth will be a night butterfly. So that's the case. Well, one of the words for moth in, say, Spanish is a night butterfly. But there's also a more common word that also we're not sure of what its etymology is. And that is true. Also, you can, when you're describing moths in other languages, they get described, as I said, as nocturnal butterflies. Although in those languages, there are often words that actually distinguish the moth from the butterfly as well. So not just the night butterfly words, but also just different words that are either inherited from another language or created from this is a root that we don't know. So, for example, like in Italian, the word falena for moth is related to phalaina, which is an ancient word from the Mediterranean, and it comes through Greek. And it's both used to describe these flying things, but also to describe, in Latin, it ends up being a word that's used for whale, and they probably come from the same. They probably come from the same root that is one of those languages that existed in the Mediterranean long before any speakers of what would become Latin or Greek existed in that area. And so there are words that are used for a moth, even in languages where they're just described as nocturnal butterflies. Now, the most obvious way to tell a difference between butterflies and moths generally is that in terms of their antennae, the moths have a kind of feather-like end to their antennae, and the butterflies tend to have these kind of club or kind of almost ball-shaped ends to their antennae. So that's one big way that people talk about the difference between the butterfly and the moth. Another thing that you see in certain languages as well, because in certain languages the word for moth relates to words that have to do with tents or vice versa, and that is because when the moth is just sitting around, its wings kind of create a little tent-like structure, where there's like a point and then it goes down like a tent. And so that's like what the moth rests like when it's resting. The butterfly tends to have the wings together and vertically above it when it's resting, because the moths have a part of the body that allows them to have their wings do that thing where they have them up together. And as I said, the butterflies tend to be active during the day, and they need to keep warm, so they kind of like do their thing in sunlight, whereas moths tend to operate at night, although there are moths that operate during the day. In terms of colors and patterns, moths can really be very colorful, like most butterflies are, and also vice versa. The butterflies can be not so colorful, like we think of when we think of moths. But that's a really red herring. That's a color pun. Because that's not really the way to tell the difference between a butterfly and a moth. Finally, though, they go through this process of change called a metamorphosis, which is just a Greek word for a transformation. And moths have things called cocoons. So those cocoons those are moths. Butterflies have things called a chrysalis. And a chrysalis, that is from an ancient, actually it's a loan word in Greek from probably the Phoenician language, which is a Semitic language. And that loan word is, in Greek, it's chrysos, which means gold. And that is a description of a gold pod that hangs off of a branch or something where a butterfly emerges from. The cocoon, it comes from an actual word in Latin that has to do with this thing that's called, sometimes in English, it's the thing where we get the English word crimson from. Which is from a Persian word through Turkish. It's the word is kermes, and that is a scale, and an insect that is a scale on oak trees, and they produce a red colored dye that was originally used to dye crimson things, so things that are crimson, and that's where we get that word in English and in some other languages as well. Now, in terms of the word butterfly, where does that come from? Odds are that it has to do with the word butter and fly. Now, older words in Anglo-Saxon for butterfly are words that sound more like the Italian word for farfalle, which probably come from the same roots as that word. And the word is something like the fifalda, and that is the Anglo-Saxon word for a butterfly, or maybe a moth, and that is not used in English. English created a word that is butter and fly very very early on in English, when English became its own language. There was the word that combined butter and fly. And there are a lot of theories about this, none of them that plausible. I have a feeling myself that it relates to the Greek situation, that chrysalis, as the gold thing pod that holds the butterfly when it's developing into a butterfly, that chrysalis, I have a feeling that the golden color of that, there are probably some butterflies that had similarly gold chrysalis as the ones that were observed in the Mediterranean, and that those gold things were what was described at the beginning as butter colored. And that would be my guess where that comes from. There are other theories about that talk about some Dutch words that have to do with excrement, and because of a word related to butterflies in Old Dutch that have to do with butter-colored excrement. It seems to me that the butter color of the chrysalis might be more likely, rather than butter color of wings. For the butterfly. So, nonetheless, that's that. Now, back to the Mothman. Now, the odds are the thing that those two couples saw in West Virginia in 1966. The odds are, or at least this is what people believe, and later on kind of figured out that maybe this is it. The thing that those two couples saw was probably a sandhill crane, which had wandered off of course, and it was really lost in West Virginia. Totally plausible and possible. Sandhill cranes are often sighted in places where they don't usually hang out because sometimes they get lost. And speaking of crimson, we were talking about the roots of the word crimson. Sandhill cranes, around their eyes, at that part of their head, they have this big crimson kind of band there. So that people are like, oh, maybe that even relates to this description of the red eyes and things like that. And that sandhill crane can get they're very large birds. They can be like 4 feet tall, maybe a little bit taller, big wingspans, close to the size that the people described. And they're just really big. So you could totally see that this might have been the very species of the bird that they had spotted. Okay, let's see what the cards have to say about our working lives today. Yellow lemons, blue dumplings, magenta noodles. Cards, tell us some things. Should have said crimson noodles. Probably wouldn't have helped. All right, here we are. It's card 17. Everything that happens to us is only partly our doing. There is no amount of plotting and planning that will result in us navigating our world exactly as we think we want to. Like that sandhill crane that got lost and ended up in West Virginia. Get in your ship, set a course, weigh anchor, and open your heart to the idea that you've been in the right port at the right time before, and you will be again. So if you needed to hear that today, I hope that helps, and I'll see you tomorrow on Life's Potluck Buffet.